Since the inauguration of President Donald Trump, the Republican majority in federal and state government have attempted to pass a little over 723 bills in an attempt to roll back protections and even criminalize the existence of transgender people. The rate of discrimination against transgender people is so high, even transgender elected officials are being discriminated against. As of now, 20 bills have passed, and this is only the fourth month of Donald Trump's presidency. It is expected to get a lot worse. Fortunately, both the transgender community and conservatives have overlooked several major issues that brought about this situation in the first place. Incidentally, it's these very issues that will be responsible for solidifying protections and even funding the health care of all transgender people across the United States. This isn't said in arrogance or with bravado. Their negligence literally holds them responsible for the proliferation of the LGBT community, condemning their crusade both morally and spiritually. As a result of their convictions, they will be forced to repeal every anti-transgender legislation at the local, state, and federal level. Hello there, my name's Lily Demerge. I'm the founder of Sanction. I started this organization to free the economically oppressed by giving people and businesses free access to food, water, shelter, electric, and communications. To accomplish this, we transform old mines across the United States into spaces for vertical farming, geothermal power plants, apartment complexes, and finally, commercial spaces. By placing this infrastructure underground in every county, it keeps CO2 emissions to a minimum and enables the population to expand the infrastructure with the growth of the population. This means that no matter how many people live within a county, food, water, shelter, electric, and communications will always be free. It also means that private interest groups like banks and corporations will never again be able to leverage the economy against its people. With your help, we will sue the federal government for the finances required to bring about this change. But before I break down the reasons I think we have a case against the federal government, I think it's important that we talk about how the transgender community got here in the first place. This isn't a simple matter of political and cultural tension bowdlerized by cultural platitudes. This is actually a very deep issue caused by an imbalance of capitalism over communism, fomenting wealth inequality and environmental contamination. In this case, by man-made endocrine disrupting chemicals. We're going to start by going over a timeline. Let's see if you can identify the reasons the LGBT community came into existence. Do you understand what's going on here? Are you seeing the parallels between the proliferation of man-made endocrine disrupting chemicals and the rise of the LGBT community? Maybe you need more evidence. Let's look at just two of the most controversial endocrine disrupting chemicals in use today, specifically that of bisphenol A and atrazine. There's more. There's a whole lot more, but I don't want to make this documentary longer than it needs to be. We'll start with bisphenol A. Research shows that prenatal exposure to bisphenol A alone can lead to structural, functional, and behavioral changes in the brain, resulting in the following: disruption of neurogenesis, or the creation of neurons, and neurodifferentiation, resulting in a reduction in the number of neurons in key regions of the brain; abnormal development of the hippocampus, a region crucial for memory and learning; reduced synaptic density and impaired synapse formation, resulting in long-term cognitive and behavioral deficits, along with decreased dendritic spine density, essential for brain connectivity and function; disruption of estrogen signaling during critical periods of brain development, leading to sex-specific changes in brain function and behavior, i.e., gender identity disorder. No, not gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria implies mental illness. This is a neurological condition. Increased risk of neurodevelopmental disorders, resulting in higher risk of ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, and anxiety-related behaviors. And finally, impaired cognitive function and behavior, characterized by deficits in memory, learning ability, and social behaviors later on in life, markedly with increased aggression, hyperactivity, and anxiety-like behaviors in offspring. That's right, the effects are generational. Alright, now let's look at the other endocrine disrupting chemical, atrazine. A widely used herbicide, atrazine has been shown to interfere with fetal brain development by disrupting hormone signaling, particularly by affecting estrogen, androgen, and dopamine pathways. Similar to bisphenol A, prenatal exposure to atrazine has also been linked to various functional, structural, and behavioral changes in the brain, resulting in the following: disruption of neurogenesis and neurodifferentiation, again, but this time resulting in changes in the number and types of neurons formed during brain development, but also reduced neuronal survival, which can impact brain function later on in life. Changes in brain structure, resulting in disruptions in the development of the hypothalamus, a brain region crucial for hormone regulation, stress responses, and behavior. Abnormalities in the hippocampus are also present, having been linked to memory and learning impairments. Altered synaptic development and plasticity, characterized by an impairment of synapse formation and neurotransmitter release, which disrupts normal brain connectivity and signal transmission. Evidence also suggests reduced synaptic plasticity, which is critical for cognitive function and learning. Next up, disruption of hormonal regulation by altering sex differentiation and the feminization of male brains. It also affects dopamine and serotonin signaling, which are essential for mood and cognitive function, while at the same time interfering with cortisol regulation and impacting stress responses. Another symptom is increased risk of neurodevelopmental disorders, with atrazine exposure linked to higher risk of ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, and cognitive impairments. Additionally, epigenetic modifications caused by atrazine can lead to changes in gene expression that, again, persist across generations. And finally, impaired cognitive function and behavior, exhibited in memory deficits, reduced learning ability, and increased impulsivity. Exposure has also been associated with heightened anxiety, depressive-like behaviors, and aggression in offspring. There are a lot more man-made endocrine-disrupting chemicals, but I think you get the point. Based off the evidence of the timeline and the scientific studies dated as far back as the 1930s, endocrine-disrupting chemicals are unequivocally tied to the rise of the LGBT demographic. Whether you're gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, asexual, or intersexed, every last one of these social identities are intimately tied to the symptoms associated with exposure to one or more of these chemicals. Now, conservatives believe transgenderism to be an issue of mental health, but that's not the entire picture. They're overlooking the biological factors that resulted in the individual developing gender identity disorder in the first place. Rather than demonize these chemicals purely based upon their correlation with the birth of the LGBT community, allow me to break down these chemicals and explain their biological modalities further. We'll use atrazine again as an example. Atrazine is known to have estrogenic effects, meaning it can mimic or interfere with the normal activity of estrogen, a crucial hormone in sexual differentiation and brain development. Atrazine has been shown to bind to estrogen receptors, specifically alpha, beta, and G protein-coupled receptors. This binding activates these receptors even in the absence of endogenous estrogen. Through this mechanism, atrazine exposure leads to the expression of estrogen-responsive genes, thus influencing processes that are typically regulated by estrogen. Now, these estrogen receptors, when activated by substances such as atrazine, initiate a cascade of molecular signals that affect the expression of specific genes. These genes are important as they are directly involved in processes such as neurogenesis, or the formation of new neurons, synaptogenesis, or the formation of synapses between neurons, cell differentiation, and migration in the brain, as well as hormonal regulation that governs sex-specific brain structure and function. Estrogen mimickers, by interacting with estrogen receptors in the fetus, alter the normal expression of these genes, leading to feminization effects in the brain, especially in a developing brain. The concept of feminization in this context refers to the development of brain structures and functions that are typically associated with female characteristics, such as increased social behavior, changes in aggression, and most importantly in reproductive behavior. Normally, the presence of testosterone during critical developmental windows masculinizes the brain, while the absence of testosterone, or in this case, the presence of estrogen, leads to its feminization. In the case of atrazine exposure, the herbicide acts like estrogen by binding to estrogen receptors during critical periods of fetal brain development, particularly when sexual differentiation of the brain is occurring. This leads to the following. Increased estrogenic signaling. The brain, influenced by estrogen signaling, develops more female-typical features, such as the regulation of brain regions involved in emotional processing, social behavior, and reproductive behaviors. Changes in neurodevelopmental pathways. In the case of changes of neurodevelopmental pathways, exposure to atrazine can disrupt normal patterns of gene expression related to brain development, resulting in a feminized brain that reflects a more female-like phenotype, even in males. The long-term consequences of such hormonal disruption during fetal development manifests itself as behavioral and physiological changes that persist into adulthood, affecting cognitive functions, behavior, fertility, and susceptibility to neurological disorders. The brain, in essence, has literally been rewired on a genetic level and has developed through normal processes into a fully functioning female brain, albeit in a male body. What you're looking at is a very rudimentary representation of a normal, healthy human brain, specifically its neural pathways. Neural pathways, for those who don't know, are the connections formed by the axons. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Here. Okay, I have another one here. Yeah, that's good. The axon is this thing. That whole elongated thing in black coming off the soma. And the soma is the The soma is, or the cell wall, is the green area right there. The blue part is separate. That's the myelin sheath. They're wrapped around the axon, and their purpose is to insulate and protect nerve cells so that the electrical impulses can travel between them more safely and efficiently. Like insulation on a high-speed cable. This part right here, the axon, the black, enables communication and neurotransmission between different parts of the brain and body. Now, getting back to this here. This is the neural pathways. This represents the neural pathways. They are essential for various functions, including processing sensory information, imitating motor actions, and forming memories. The maze each maze, each maze represents neuroplasticity in action. So the black line, I don't know if you can see this here. The black line here, it's going through the maze. The black line represents a task or a command, and the maze in red represents neurons in the brain. Maybe this is a little bit backwards. It should have been the red line instead, black. I fixed it in another thing. But anyway, for a task to be completed, the signal must navigate through the maze. See? Navigates through the maze and out the end. Let's navigate through the maze. Where was I have notes here. Sorry. So, alright. The maze, the black line represents a task or command, and the maze in red represents, alright. So for a task to be completed, the signal must navigate through the maze and exit on the other side, producing an output, like moving your hand, if you will. So notice how the black line in this here, it's pretty complicated. It makes a series of turns to reach the end goal, to essentially complete the task. Now at this stage of the maze, this stage of neuroplasticity, the brain is working overtime. It's not efficient, and the brain's using too many neurons to complete a task. If this were a computer program, this right here, this maze, would be the equivalent of bad code. It's unoptimized, uses excessive computational overhead. It may work, but there are too many steps to achieve the same outcome. And as a result, the person is experiencing anxiety for their shortcomings. There's difficulty when you're learning something new. Fortunately, though, however, the brain likes efficiency. Moreover, the brain has an evolutionary algorithm, meaning it can rewrite the same code to reduce the number of neurons or logic gates needed to achieve the same outcome. Maybe that's a bad analogy, but you get the point. The brain, or the maze in this point, or should I say the vice versa, the maze, or the brain, will change gradually to make the task easier for the individual. And as a result, the brain or the individual is rewarded with endorphins. Becomes easier. So what does that look like? Okay. Have you ever played basketball in school? At first, everything feels awkward. Dribbling the ball while walking is fine, but the moment you try to run and keep control of it, your movements feel clumsy. You have to focus on every little detail, how hard to push the ball, when to catch it, how to position your hand. Your brain is working overtime, sending signals through inefficient pathways, just like the black line, turning through the maze. But over time, as you keep practicing, something changes. The movements become smoother, more automatic. You don't even have to think about each step anymore. Your brain has rewritten the code. The neural pathways have optimized, removing unnecessary steps, making the process faster and more efficient. Now dribbling while running feels effortless. At this point, you don't even have to think about it. It just happens. This is neuroplasticity in action. Your brain takes a once difficult task and refines the neural connections, streamlining the process so it requires less effort. The same thing happens when learning to type, to play an instrument, or even drive a car. At first, the brain takes the long route, but with enough practice, it finds a shortcut. That is normal brain function, and your experiences and trauma help determine how it works. So, what is neuroplasticity like after the brain has been exposed to endocrine disrupting chemicals? How does it function after it's been irreversibly altered by man-made EDCs in utero? Want to see? This is it. See? Notice the black box? Notice the pencil line. The neurotransmission. as it goes through the maze of neurons. For what is natural to the individual, the path is short, clear. The person doesn't even think about their actions. It just comes naturally. If you're a transgender woman or a woman in the body of a man, stuff like empathy, displays of emotion, they come naturally. Depending on the time and amount of exposure to certain endocrine disrupting chemicals, they're more prone to risk aversion, rely more on intuition, tend to care more about grooming and fashion, and they're attracted more to men. Their brain is fundamentally that of a woman, so their lifestyle reflects that of a woman. Okay. Now look at the path in red. You see the path in red? This one signifies what the individual feels is inappropriate and what society deems to be appropriate for the individual. Notice the black blocks in the maze, obscuring the way to an efficient and culturally appropriate action. The blocks signify the areas of the brain where the neural pathways have been malformed or hindered by these chemicals. The clear route has been obstructed, forcing the brain to work harder to achieve the same result, resulting in a less efficient neural pathways. As a result of this, the individual experiences a permanent state of anxiety. Over time, this anxiety builds into depression, until the individual ultimately commits suicide. That's the reason that trans people commit suicide at a much higher rate. Do you want to understand what I'm saying? Okay. To the individual with gender identity disorder, in this case, a female brain inhabiting the wrong body, the mere sight of a penis on their masculine frame brings with it an inexplicable anxiety. Add societal pressures to conform to a culture built upon one's sex, and this anxiety is multiplied exponentially. A female in a man's body faces considerable challenges that prevent her from being herself. She's incapable of expressing her nurturing and caregiving instincts without society suspecting her of being a predator, even if the child is biologically her own. She's incapable of emotional expressiveness, without society criticizing or forcing her to suppress her more expressive traits for more masculine stoic behavior. Her ability to bond with other women is also stunted, for women will very often believe her to be a predator with ulterior motives rather than a woman sharing her genuine interest. All society sees is the man, not the woman inside, and as a result, the brain's inability to optimize and normalize masculine behavior leads to more anxiety, guilt, and depression. Do you understand now? The endocrine disrupting chemicals have irreversibly feminized his brain, resulting in a shift in hormone regulation and permanent disruption in normal brain function. These changes don't just affect cognitive ability, they alter the very way the brain processes and responds to stimuli. Moreover, the effects of these chemicals are far-reaching, impacting not just gender identity, but also behaviors and other cognitive functions. One of the other most notable consequences is the emergence of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and autism spectrum disorder. The same endocrine disrupting chemicals responsible for disrupting neuroplasticity are also responsible for developmental issues that affect attention, focus, impulse control, social interactions, and communications. These neurodevelopmental disorders are all just manifestations of how the brain's wiring has been influenced by man-made environmental toxins. They are not mere conditions of behavioral psychology that can be worked out in a clinic with Jordan Peterson. They are biological outcomes of chemical interference in the brain's development. Which brings me to the next topic. The reproductive system. When people think about the reproductive system, they usually picture one thing, the penis or the vagina. But that's just the surface. Beneath the skin, there's an entire network of organs, glands, and neural pathways working together to make attraction, arousal, and reproduction possible. To understand how gender and sexuality work biologically, we need to understand each component of the reproductive system. Let's start with the penis, which is the external organ involved in sexual function. Inside it runs the urethra, a tube that carries both urine and semen. The journey of sperm starts in the testes, where they are produced. These sperm are then stored and matured in the epididymis. From there, they travel through the vas deferens, which connects to the seminal vesicles, which produce much of the fluid in semen. The prostate adds additional fluid, completing the semen mixture that is ejaculated. Of course, this process is regulated by signals from the brain. The brain plays a crucial role in sexual function, especially in initiating and regulating sexual attraction, arousal, and the physical responses of erection and ejaculation. The hypothalamus, along with limbic system structures like the amygdala, process sensory and emotional stimuli that drive sexual desire. These signals influence autonomic and somatic pathways via the spinal cord. The parasympathetic pelvic splanchnic nerves from the sacral spinal cord promote erection by increasing blood flow to the penis. Sympathetic fibers via the hypogastric nerves from the thoracolumbar spinal cord coordinate emission and ejaculation. Meanwhile, the pudendal nerve, a somatic nerve, carries sensory feedback from the genitals to the brain and controls the pelvic floor muscles that contract during orgasm. Together, these neural circuits form a feedback loop between the brain and the body, making the nervous system, not just the reproductive organs, essential for healthy sexual function. As you can see, each part of this anatomy is essential for reproduction. If any part is disrupted, it can affect sexual desire and function as well as the ability to reproduce. We know from earlier that endocrine disrupting chemicals alter brain function in utero, particularly affecting the hypothalamus and hormone regulation, which influence sexual and reproductive health. So, why is this important? Have you not figured it out yet? According to Matthew 19 and 12 of the Holy Bible, every transgender person is a qualified eunuch. Jesus himself is quoted as saying, Let's break this down into its parts. You know this already. This would entail hermaphrodites or intersex people. Speaking scientifically, these would be humans with Turner syndrome, or people with one X chromosome, or Klinefelter syndrome, that's two X chromosomes and a Y chromosome. It would also include people with hormonal variations, like androgen insensitivity syndrome, where a human with XY chromosomes fully or partially develops the anatomy of a woman. There are additional medical considerations, but you get the point. They do not fit the mold of male or female. If it's not painfully obvious at this point, this part of the verse represents the gay and transgender community. Yes, originally, eunuchs were created through force with a knife, but advancements in medical and chemical science have afforded nations the ability to convince entire populations to do it to themselves. In this case, European and later Chinese state-owned agrochemical companies sell endocrine-disrupting chemicals like Atrazine to conservative farmers here in the U.S., marketing them as a herbicide. Then, in their ignorance, these same farmers spray our crops with these chemicals, contaminating not only our food and water, but also the environment. Farmers living at the epicenter of this environmental disaster experience increased rates of cancer, while pregnant mothers give birth to children who are later diagnosed with gender identity disorder, ADHD, and autism. Don't even get me started on the Republican Party's largest financiers, corporations that are directly responsible for the proliferation of bisphenol A and B. Plastic has become so ubiquitous they're seeing it in human testicles, and the United Nations have pushed for a replacement migration in an attempt to hide the collapse of global birth rates. And who do you think they're going to use as a scapegoat for all this once the knowledge becomes more common? Us. That's who. Ah, yes, the last part of Matthew 19 and 12. Believe it or not everyone who identifies as transgender suffers from endocrine disrupting chemicals. This is going to take a little explaining, so bear with me. But this is a tangent worth exploring, so we're definitely going to talk about it. According to the timeline, we know that the first diagnosis of transsexualism, now transgenderism, and I'm being entirely facetious here, began around 1965, 4 years after atrazine became one of the most widely used herbicides in America. Then, after the Stonewall riots of 1969, transgender people began forming the first support groups to fight for their rights. Relatively unknown, these groups eked out a life of survival among others, and helped each other get the necessary medical treatments they needed to survive. Then, in 2013, the transgender people rose to prominence when a major network television show, Orange is the New Black, raised awareness about transgender rights and representation. At the same time, Gigi Gorgeous became the face of transgender people online, with Nikita Dragun and Steph Stangetti following a few years later. So tell me, what effect do you think this had on the trans community, whose primary purpose before was navigating a hellscape of limited health care and protecting each other from violence? What impact do you think the media had on the public? Witnessing individuals they once viewed as unattractive, emasculated men transform themselves into literal female supermodels. What do you think the response was? The transition from survival-focused underground networks to hyper-visible, aesthetically driven public figures changed the landscape of the trans community. It brought representation, economic opportunities, and mainstream discourse, but also commodification, unrealistic expectations, and cultural backlash. Public response was divided. Some embraced trans identities as part of evolving gender norms, while others saw them as a challenge to deeply ingrained worldviews. More importantly, however, transgender people suffering from endocrine disrupting chemicals were overshadowed by a new wave of individuals who had never before experienced such symptoms. Suddenly, the trans identity they had fought to legitimize, one rooted in gender identity disorder and medically transitioning to lead a normal life, was replaced by a cultural movement that rejected both of those principles. Today, the transgender community is represented by two groups, the Truscum and the Two Cutes. The Truscum make up the original spirit of the transgender community, people who have been afflicted by endocrine disrupting chemicals in the womb. These individuals believe that being transgender is inherently linked to gender identity disorder, a medical condition that requires medically transitioning to be valid. This does not just mean hormone replacement therapy and cosmetic surgeries either. It means complete medically transitioning, including bottom surgery. This group argues that transgender identity should be grounded in biological and neurological factors, backed by medical research and diagnosis. They see the rise of gender self-identification without dysphoria as a delusion of the trans experience and a threat to the credibility of medically transitioning. Worse still, because the goal of transitioning is to lead a normal life, it is rare for them to self-identify as being transgender. They see themselves as women and live inconspicuously. The Two Cutes, on the other hand, believe that gender is entirely a social construct, separate from biological or medical considerations. According to the Two Cute perspective, one does not need gender identity disorder to be transgender, nor does one need to medically transition to validate their identity. They advocate for self-identification as the defining factor of gender identity and push for inclusivity, embracing non-binary, gender-fluid, and xenogender identities. Because of this, the focus of the transgender community as a whole has shifted from scientific legitimacy to social discourse. And you who belong to conservative-led groups, are using the Two Cute perspective to delegitimize a very real existential threat to national security. Endocrine disrupting chemicals. Now back on the topic of eunuchs. Whether these people suffer from gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder is irrelevant, because ultimately, if they choose to get bottom surgery, they fall within the last part of Matthew 19 and 12. They have effectively made themselves eunuchs, and under the Bill of Rights of the United States of America, they are protected under the First Amendment. In fact, all three groups are protected. It is unconstitutional to deny gender-affirming care to transgender people, no matter what their circumstance or age is. Irrespective of our opinions, you cannot deny a parent's right to change the sex of their child while at the same time allowing them to continue the practice of circumcision. Many would argue that it's still genital mutilation. If the practice is so abhorrent to you, repeal the First Amendment, but be warned, forced injections of RFID tags for banking and a social credit system will soon follow. Donald Trump, Elon Musk, conservatives, and even liberals, you need to learn to walk in love. There's a tremendous opportunity here to sue the elites responsible for poisoning the world. But if we keep fighting amongst ourselves, then we will earn nothing from this. When the Capitol Hill protests were ongoing, it led to the closure of multiple businesses and the deaths of Horace Anderson and Antonio Mays. Perhaps most noteworthy, however, was the sharp decline of property values and the subsequent purchase of entire city blocks for pennies on the dollar by the very fascist Antifa were protesting against. Now, conservatives are targeting undocumented migrants, the very people who could be building our infrastructure and excavating our mines, for vertical farms and geothermal energy. Do you know what terror management theory is? Listen carefully. If you take anything away from this, it should be this one thing. Terror management theory is a psychological framework that explains how humans cope with the existential anxiety caused by the unique awareness of their own mortality. The theory, developed by social psychologists Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pazinski, is rooted in the ideas of cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker, particularly from his books The Denial of Death, Escape from Evil, and The Birth and Death of Meaning. Terror management theory posits that unlike other animals, humans have a unique capacity for self-awareness, which includes knowing that death is inevitable. This awareness, however, creates a profound anxiety, which, if left unmanaged, could lead to overwhelming fear and paralysis. To cope, humans construct cultural worldviews that provide a sense of meaning, purpose, and a set of practices in which to achieve immortality, either literally through the practice of religion or symbolically through the practice of leaving a lasting legacy through accomplishments, family, or national identity. Problems inevitably arise, however, when people from different cultures interact. Research on terror management theory has proven that when an individual encounters a person with a different culture or worldview, it inevitably exposes them to the anxiety of death that their own culture was meant to suppress. When this happens, it leads the individual to instinctively defend their own cultural worldview while rejecting, devaluing, or even killing those who hold different beliefs. This psychological mechanism ultimately explains why cultural clashes, religious intolerance, and political polarization intensify during periods of rapid social change or perceived existential threat. Rather than seeing an opposing culture as merely different, people will experience it as a fundamental challenge to the meaning system that protects them from existential fear. This then leads to an escalation of intergroup tensions, where each side perceives the other as dangerous or morally corrupt, fueling cycles of prejudice, discrimination, and even violence. Do you understand? I hope you understand this. This right here, this terror management theory, it's the reason Jesus died on the cross for our sins. Humans put the law before God and made their cultural traditions into idols. In doing so, they rejected the very foundation of life itself. Terror management theory explains why people cling to their cultural traditions, even when those traditions are killing them spiritually. But the message of Jesus is simple. You don't need to construct a cultural fortress to hide from death, because he has already conquered it. Through his death and resurrection, Jesus shattered the need for human-made worldviews that only serve to divide us. He tore down the walls that separate people based on race, nationality, or ideology. The solution to the cycle of fear, hatred, and division is not found in clinging to human traditions, nor in waging war against opposing worldviews. It is found in surrendering to Christ, who removes the fear of death and replaces it with the assurance of eternal life. This is why Jesus had to die, not just to fulfill prophecy, but to free humanity from the prison of their own cultural illusions, the very illusions that lead people to reject others, persecute those who are different, and ultimately crucify the Son of God. His death was not just a sacrifice for sin. It was the ultimate act of breaking the cycle of fear that has enslaved humanity since the fall in the Garden of Eden. Through Christ, we are no longer bound by the terror of mortality. We no longer need to construct fragile cultural defenses to hide from death. Instead, we live in the certainty that in Him, death has already been defeated. If you need further proof of this, read the book of Galatians in the New Testament, in a translation of the Holy Bible that you understand. Christianity is not a religion. It's freedom from it. The Jews are not someone to mimic or admire. They are the control mechanism to scientific and economic progress, made obsolete by the sacrifice of Jesus the Christ. Jesus is quoted as saying, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." What do you think this means? In Leviticus, of the Geneva Bible translation, dated as far back as the 1500s, it states that the man also that lieth with the male, as one lieth with a woman, they have both committed abomination. They shall die the death, their blood shall be upon them. In later translations, however, the verse is translated as, "If a man practices homosexuality, having sex with another man as with a woman, both men have committed a detestable act. They must both be put to death, for they are guilty of a capital offense." The difference between these two verses is that the older translation warns of a death that will result as a result of their sins, like putting your hand in a fire and suffering its grievous but natural consequences. In the newer translation, however, punishment is derived by people reinforcing a cultural standard. We just learned that endocrine disrupting chemicals are responsible for the rise of the LGBT community. That conservatives here in America poisoned our food and water with bisphenol A and atrazine. At the same time, these same cultural Christians reference Revelation in the Holy Bible to condemn the very people they poisoned. Who is at fault here? What is sin when your brain has been mutated by endocrine disrupting chemicals? The difference between Judaism and Christianity is simple. Where the Mosaic Law seeks to condemn and punish behavior, the grace and teachings of Jesus the Christ are to treat and cure it. This doesn't just apply to those with same-sex attraction as a result of exposure to EDCs either. It means everything. From the school shooter, whose rage and lack of empathy was shaped from years of bullying, abuse, and trauma, to the home invader, who learned to survive by stealing from others because the economy doesn't sustain a basic standard of living, to the pedophile, whose desires were formed from repeated abuse in their childhood. Every one of these examples and more are neural pathways forcefully developed by trauma, and it is the responsibility of every Christian to change them through the application of love. It is our responsibility to change the environment and treat the afflicted in a manner that dissuades lasciviousness and increases fellowship, not condemnation. The vast majority of illegal immigrants and transgender people have harmed no one, and we have a responsibility to show them compassion without indoctrination. Hi, my name's Lily. I created this video as a sort of Kickstarter to a larger crowdfunding campaign. It's my intention to sue the federal government as well as several multinational corporations that are directly responsible for this, the spread of atrazine and bisphenol A. Other endocrine disrupting chemicals as well. I put in a prompt for how much it would cost. I put a prompt in for ChatGPT to see how much it would cost to sue, and it gave me a thing upwards of 3 million to 15 million. I don't have that, obviously, so I started a crowdfunding campaign. That's the reason I started the campaign. If you want to support our endeavor, this project, please go to givebutter.com/eunuch. That's EUNUCH. I'll provide a link in the description for you to click into. And then if you want to support me, because I realized that, well, let's just be honest. What is the probability that we're going to get paid? I'm going to make 3 to 15 million on crowdfunding. I'm not certain. I've never done it before. So I am in the middle of creating what's the word? Sorry. I'm in the middle of creating an e-commerce platform. If you support me, I'll create the platform. I'll finish it, I should say. And then all the money that's generated from the platform, that will go to helping with this campaign. This is not just going to help transgender people. This is going to help people with who've had miscarriages, people who've died, who've had children die as a result of this, because there's higher suicide rates as a result of exposure. So I want to get those people compensation as well. There's higher cancer rates, obviously. My hope here is anything that's directly tied to it. And I don't care what your affiliation, your political or religious affiliation is. If you've been affected, I want to get you compensated. My goal is to make a minimum of 1 billion from these lawsuits. Anything after that is fine. And I want to make sure that it gets directly into your pockets. I'm going to be completely transparent throughout this whole process. So if you support this endeavor, whether you support trans lives or believe a man is a man or a woman is a, two genders, what have you, that's fine. But I want compensation for the damages. And I'm pretty certain that you want the compensation as well. So if you support me, thank you. I hope we're fruitful. Thank you.